The story of Western reform in the Balkans begins with good intentions and ends with an uncomfortable question. For decades, the United States and the European Union have shaped the political destiny of this region. Aid flowed in, institutions were redesigned, statues were erected. In Albania, a statue of George W. Bush still stands in a town square, a symbol of trust, gratitude, and alignment. Yet beneath these symbols, something went wrong. Anti-corruption became the headline. Arrests became proof. Optics replaced outcomes. And justice, real justice, was slowly pushed aside. I want you to pause here because this is not just a Balkan story. It is a global pattern. When powerful outsiders push reform, weak institutions often learn how to perform change, not how to embody it. The result can look like progress, while quietly hollowing out democracy itself. If this sounds familiar, stay with me, and if you want deeper analysis like this, make sure you're following, because to understand what broke, we first need to understand what was being built. What was being built, at least on paper, was a fast track to Europe. For countries like Albania, Montenegro, and Serbia, EU accession became the central political objective. It promised markets, legitimacy, security, and a final escape from the instability of the 1990s. But accession is not just about laws, it is about institutions. And institutions take time. Here is where the tension begins. Brussels and Washington needed measurable progress, reports, benchmarks, deliverables. Weak states, eager to belong, learned quickly what was being measured and what was not. Judicial independence was praised, prosecutorial power was expanded, anti-corruption bodies were elevated as symbols of seriousness. But safeguards moved slower, oversight lagged behind, democratic accountability became secondary to enforcement statistics. So the core problem is not corruption alone, it is the mismatch between external pressure and internal capacity. When reform is judged by visible crackdowns rather than invisible procedures, systems adapt in dangerous ways. This is how a reform agenda can slowly mutate into something else entirely. To understand that birth, we need to return to the post-Cold War moment when the Western Balkans became a strategic laboratory. After conflict and fragmentation, the region was seen in Washington and Brussels as both a risk and an opportunity. Stability had to be engineered, alignment had to be locked in, legal reform became the preferred tool, clean, technical, and seemingly neutral. Build courts, empower prosecutors, write new constitutions. Democracy, it was assumed, would follow. But this logic ignored economic and political cycles. These states were still consolidating power, still vulnerable to elite capture, still dependent on external validation. When reform is introduced from the outside, incentives matter more than ideals. Governments learned that accession rewards visibility, not patience. So reform timelines compressed. Prosecutorial authority expanded faster than judicial culture. Independence was defined narrowly as insulation from politics, not accountability to society. The system tilted toward enforcement because enforcement was legible to outsiders. This is not unique to the Balkans. Any state racing to meet international legal standards faces the same temptation: perform compliance first, fix foundations later. And once that imbalance is built into the system, it does not correct itself. It escalates. The first visible rupture came not with collapse, but with applause. Headlines celebrated arrests. Officials posed before cameras. International reports cited progress. In country after country, new anti-corruption bodies moved fast, aggressively, and publicly. This was framed as courage, as proof that reform was finally working. But look closer, and a different pattern emerges. Prosecutors gained extraordinary power, while courts, oversight bodies, and parliamentary checks lagged behind. Pre-trial detention expanded, investigations became opaque. The system learned that spectacle mattered more than verdicts. In Montenegro, sweeping justice strategies produced little real accountability. In Serbia, the moment Western funding disappeared, the language of reform flipped overnight. NGOs became enemies, not partners. Power centralized quickly, justified in the name of sovereignty and security. This is the paradox. External pressure created urgency, but urgency rewarded control. And control, once normalized, rarely retreats on its own. If you are watching this and thinking, this feels familiar, you're right. This is how democratic erosion often begins, quietly, legally, and with international approval. If this kind of analysis helps you see past the headlines, stay with me, because the real story is not the crisis itself, but the system that made it inevitable. What made this outcome predictable was not corruption alone, but design. At the heart of these reforms sat a quiet assumption that an empowered, independent prosecutor could compensate for weak institutions. Foreign advisors supported this logic. Prosecutorial bodies were insulated from politics, shielded from interference, and given broad authority. On paper, this looked like progress. In reality, it created an imbalance. When prosecutors dominate a system without strong judicial review, transparency, or democratic oversight, power concentrates. Independence becomes isolation. Accountability becomes optional. And justice begins to follow incentives, not principles. EU accession frameworks reinforced this distortion. Performance was measured through action, raids, arrests, detentions, because those are visible. Due process is not. Safeguards do not generate headlines. Monthly reviews, procedural delays, proportionality, these rarely travel well in progress reports. So institutions adapted rationally. They delivered what external partners rewarded: high-profile cases, symbolic targets, speed over rigor. This is how selective justice emerges without explicit intent, not through conspiracy but through structure. A system designed to prove reform externally while drifting internally. Once this logic takes hold, correcting it becomes politically costly, because pulling back looks like weakness. And that sets the stage for a second, more dangerous escalation. The second escalation arrived when reform began to devour legitimacy itself. In Albania, the special structure against corruption and organized crime, SPAK, became the symbol of seriousness. Born from the 2016 constitutional reforms, backed by the US State Department and the European Commission, and funded with more than $27.5 million, it was meant to restore trust. Instead, it concentrated fear. High-profile detentions multiplied, oversight thinned, pretrial arrests shifted from exception to norm, cases stretched on without charges, while public explanations grew scarce. The logic was unmistakable: detain first, justify later. The detention of former President Ilir Meta triggered accusations of politicization. The prosecution of ethnic Greek mayor Fredi Baleri alarmed minority rights advocates. And the most destabilizing case, the prolonged, nearly year-long pre-trial detention of Tirana's mayor, Erion Velic, cut to the core of democratic credibility. Even after a constitutional court ruling reinstated him as mayor, detention continued without formal charges. Each case delivered headlines, each signaled compliance, and each quietly eroded the distinction between justice and power. This is the moment when reform stops being corrective and becomes coercive. And when that line is crossed, ordinary citizens begin to feel it first. For most people, this is where the story stops being abstract and becomes personal. If you are an ordinary citizen in Albania or anywhere in the Western Balkans, the message is no longer about fighting corruption. It is about uncertainty. You watch powerful figures detained without clear timelines. You see cases drag on without explanation. And you begin to ask a quiet question: what protection do I have? When pretrial detention becomes routine, fear replaces trust. When prosecutors answer to no one, silence becomes rational. You do not need to be guilty to feel vulnerable. You only need to be inconvenient. This is the human cost of institutional imbalance. Young people leave, investors hesitate, civic life shrinks. Democracy does not collapse overnight, it thins slowly until participation feels risky. If you've ever wondered why so many leave, why optimism drains away, this is part of the answer. And if this matters to you, if you believe justice should protect citizens, not intimidate them, stay with me. Share this perspective, because what happens next does not stop at national borders. What unfolds next is no longer a domestic issue, it becomes geopolitical. When justice systems lose credibility, allies take notice, investors reassess risk, diplomatic language hardens quietly. In Brussels, progress reports grow cautious. In Washington, enthusiasm fades. Legal reform was meant to anchor the Western Balkans to the Euro-Atlantic order, but instead it has introduced strategic ambiguity. Authoritarian actors exploit this vacuum. When EU credibility weakens, alternative narratives move in. Rule of law becomes negotiable. Alignment becomes transactional. The region drifts, not dramatically but incrementally, away from shared democratic norms. This is the hidden cost of performative reform. It weakens soft power. It undermines the very leverage the EU and the US depend on. And it sends a signal far beyond the Balkans that democratic standards are flexible when geopolitics demands speed. Other accession states are watching. Other reforming governments are learning. The lesson is dangerous but clear. Deliver optics, manage pressure, centralize quietly, and once that lesson spreads, reversing it becomes exponentially harder. So the real question is no longer what went wrong, but what comes next. Looking forward, there are only 3 plausible paths, and none are cost-free. The first is correction. External partners slow down. Benchmarks change. Due process becomes as measurable as arrests. Pre-trial detention is restricted. Oversight is restored. This path is quieter, slower, and politically inconvenient, but it rebuilds trust. Institutions mature. Reform becomes real, not theatrical. The second path is stagnation. The system remains as it is. High-profile cases continue. EU language stays ambiguous. Citizens adapt to uncertainty. Democracy survives, but thinner, more fragile. This is the most likely outcome, because it requires the least courage. The third path is decay. Prosecutorial power hardens into political leverage. Selective justice becomes normalized. External partners disengage further. Legitimacy collapses from within. Reform turns into repression, legally justified. History tells us systems tend toward the path they reward. And for now, incentives still favor speed over substance. Which future emerges will not depend on speeches or summits, but on whether rules begin to matter more than results. And that choice brings us to the final, unavoidable insight. The final insight is uncomfortable but necessary. Corruption cannot be defeated by breaking the rules meant to restrain power. Justice cannot be proven through detentions alone. And democracy cannot survive if legitimacy is sacrificed for reputation. What the Western Balkans reveal is not a failure of intent, but a failure of design. When reform is measured by visibility instead of fairness, institutions learn the wrong lesson. They optimize for approval, not for justice. And once that logic sets in, everyone loses, citizens, allies, and the reformers themselves. The irony is stark. In trying to accelerate Europe, the system risks reproducing the very abuses Europe was meant to prevent. Real reform is slower. It is quieter. It insists on due process even when cameras are watching. It protects the innocent, even when optics demand action. And it understands that democratic integrity matters more than deliverables. If this analysis helped you see the system behind the headlines, don't stop here. Share it, question it, stay engaged. Because the future of reform here and elsewhere will depend on whether we choose justice that looks good or justice that actually works. And that conversation is only just beginning.